Elise and I talked about doing was we would switch off and on through the slideshow. So she'll present a few, I'll present a few, and we'll go back and forth that way. But um, we're both pretty comfortable with if you guys have questions that come up during our little spiel, just stop and ask, or you can write it on a piece of paper and remember to ask at the end. But interruptions are fine too, as far as I'm concerned. So Lucy, as you guys all know, Lucy is my daughter who's been working on an internship with EFTA for a while. Started what, October, November, something like that. And I've been meeting some of the other volunteers that she works with and listening to her talk about the kind of work they do. And it seemed to me like this was a great opportunity for the Corps to put in a good plug for careers in regulation and specifically careers at the Army Corps of Engineers, which I feel pretty confident is not the first thing that comes to mind for people who've graduated with a degree in environmental studies. So anyway, I'm Frankie Malamud Rome. I'm project manager at the Corps. I'll let Elise introduce herself and then start in on the her set of slides.
Hi everyone, I am Elise Piazza, also a project manager at the Corps, and I joined 3 years ago right after graduating with my bachelor's from college. So I was not in your shoes that long ago. So feel free to ask any questions you have about our presentation, getting a job at the Corps, how to get a job once you graduate college, all those things. And I think you should be able to see my screen now. So I'll go ahead and advance the slide. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to give you a very brief history of environmental regulations and waters. Then we're going to move over to what do we do in the regulatory program? What is our jurisdiction? What sort of activities do we regulate? And then we're going to talk about why you guys are uniquely well suited for the Corps. And we're going to talk a little bit about San Francisco Bay Area specific issues that we face. So here is the brief history of environmental regulation. So environmental regulation goes all the way back to the Magna Carta, which protected navigation, and ancient Greek natural law and Roman law, which led to the public trust doctrine. And what that says is that you can read it there, but certain natural and cultural resources are preserved for public use, and that the government owns and must protect and maintain these resources for the public's use. And what we have here is a history of the legal framework for U.S. water resource regulation. You can see it starts at the mid to late 1800s. Where we start to focus is the River Harbors Act of 1899, which gave the Corps control to over obstructions in navigable waterways. And then in 1948, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was passed. And then that was amended in 1972 to become the Clean Water Act. The Rivers and Harbors Act and the Clean Water Act are what we at the Corps regulate today. And there's a bunch of information on this slide that's super interesting, but I'm going to move past it for right now. What led to the Federal Water Control Act and, of course, the Clean Water Act was this environmental movement stemming from environmental disasters such as the Cuyahoga River fires and environmentalists such as Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring talking about pesticide use. So that was, again, very, very brief history. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Clean Water Act and the Rivers Harbors Act, and that's why that's important to the Corps. But what we have here is, of course, the area we all know and love, and some pictures of some areas that are regulated by the Corps. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Frankie, and she's going to talk about the Corps' jurisdiction.
Hi, okay, great. I found my mute and unmute button. Yeah, so just going back to our little outline. So now we're going to talk about the Corps and what we regulate. And just so you guys understand the nexus here. So obviously Congress passes laws like the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 and the Clean Water Act of 1972 and then amended in 77 and the Protection Research Sanctuaries Act. So those are all laws passed by Congress. And then they have to be implemented. How do we basically, laws are written pretty simply, and then it's how you actually carry them out that's the regulations part, right? So we're regulators, um, and these acts or these laws that we regulate, we do so by giving, for example, defining what do we mean by water, and what do we mean by navigation, and what do we mean by this and that, and how are we going to what's the process by which we're going to regulate these resources. So um, as Elise mentioned a couple times, the first law that came under the purview of the Corps of Engineers for regulating was the Rivers and Harbors Act, Section 10. So it's only part of that law, but it's the part that has to do with navigation of U.S. waterways and making sure that those waterways are navigable and not blocked by construction or structures placed there. The other law that we uphold and we regulate is the Clean Water Act. So that seems in some ways kind of strange that the Army, the US Army, would be regulating the Clean Water Act, but we do so because we were already charged with the Rivers and Harbors Act, Section 10. So it all starts to sort of pile on. It's like lesson in life that you can take home is whatever you volunteer to do is going to become yours permanently and will probably expand. So the third law that Elise and I don't actually have a whole lot to do with the way the San Francisco district of the Corps regulatory divvies up workload is the Section 103 of Marine Protection Research Sanctuaries Act of 72. It has to do with dredging and what to do with dredged material. So we don't normally have to worry about that because there's a separate little division within our division that takes care of that. Okay, so the next slide gets into a little bit more. So what does that mean that we actually do? So we say we regulate to basically carry out these laws that were passed by Congress. What we're actually doing is protecting navigation and protecting the aquatic environment. And with other environmental laws that have been passed, like the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act, and a few others that we'll talk about later, we have to, whenever we issue a permit, we have to kind of find a balance between the natural environment, the aquatic environment we're protecting, but also the public interest. So development in some cases is in the public interest, right? Housing is in the public interest. You know, jobs for people, the economy, having some level of industry is in the public interest, and we have to sort of balance these trade-offs and make sure that the most environmentally protecting project is the one that gets permitted. And then we encourage and support people who come to us for a permit. We encourage them to modify their project to make it the most environmentally sustainable and least impactful. So let's move on to the next slide that shows us out there doing these things. So you can see there's an element of work in waterways. This is a wetland that my friend Sarai is now standing in the middle of and delineating. And we'll talk a little bit about delineation soon. But that's the waters of the U.S. where she is right now. And a little more obviously, where the dredging ship is out there, that's obviously in a waters of the US. It's in the middle, I believe, of the bay here, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it's out in the bay. We also work with project proponents who are building on site their projects. So this is a project that's in construction in the lower right. And we go and we check on them. We say, hey, you said you were going to build it this way. What are you doing in the middle of our wetland dumping a bunch of concrete? Um, so there's that aspect of our jobs. It's called enforcement. And then there's the really fun part. You guys would never have to do any of this. It's dealing with boxes and boxes of paperwork. All right, let's go to the next slide. And just so I remember, Elise, if I over talk, let me know if I'm going into your slides, because once I start talking, I forget which slides I was supposed to stop at. I think it's 20 something, right? 23. Yeah. Okay. So let's go. Did it advance? Because it's still showing the pictures of people standing in wetlands here.
Is it showing
There
the
it
next
goes.
slide?
It
Okay.
now shows, yes. So so when we talk about what we regulate, we have to know what's within our jurisdiction. We regulate certain activities that occur within our jurisdiction. So what is our jurisdiction? Well, our jurisdiction, just to say it's waters, is kind of vague. Um, and so we have to define what we mean by waters, specifically waters of the United States, um, and not only scientifically define them, but also legally, because for regulations, it's the legal context and authority that allows us to do the regulations. So let's go to the next slide, where we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what are waters of the United States. So the first one, the first slide here is just saying waters, navigable waters of the US are those waters that are including territorial seas that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tides. So if you're out there in Marin, just walk about what, Lucy, what is it, 200 or 300 yards from where you guys sleep, you're stepping into the Pacific Ocean. That's a regulated water. That's a navigable water of the US. Also, those waterways that have a connection to transportation of interstate commerce. So if there's a commercial nexus, or if, say, Lake Tahoe, for example, is an interstate water. The next set of definitions we're going to talk about are waters of the US, not for navigable waters, but just in general, waters of the US. So all those navigable waters, they are waters of the US. Now the other ones are ones where the legal definition has changed often. And what happens is, in the regulations, they're defined. Waters of the US are 1, 2, 3, this, that, streams, tributaries, wetlands, blah, 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 blah. And then somebody goes to court and sues, and then we have to come up with a more, and often the courts decide what is a more specific definition for that. So in 1986, they came up with a way of defining and delineating waters of the US using what was called significant nexus. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because right now you guys aren't going to be quizzed on delineating waters of the US. This is just a little bit of a look how regulations change. So the next slide, that significant nexus definition for waters of the US was changed in 2015 after a couple of years of the EPA and the Army Corps getting together and defining more comprehensively what are waters of the US. And that was the 2015 rule, which was within a couple of days, um, uh, put a hold on because people sued. And so then we went back and forth, um, back to significant nexus determination, and then we went to the navigable waters protection rule that the Trump administration promulgated, said, actually, this is what will define it. And surprising to all of you, I'm sure, it left out a lot of categories of waterways that had been covered under the earlier definitions. So that got contested and sued in court. And we went back to the significant nexus. And then in the last few months, the new Waters of the U.S. Rule 2023 was put out in the public register and is now the definition for waters of the U.S. And then it was um, sued in court. And so this only applies to some states, not all. But it does apply to California. So California has implemented the Waters of the U.S. Rule 2023, but a whole bunch of other states have gone back to the significant nexus definition. So it's a it's an interesting field because it's a very dynamic definition of what it is we are, where our jurisdiction is. We can go to the next one. This is just a simplified diagram. You can get it off our website real easily. It's just kind of a one pager when you prepare for your job interview at the Corps. You can have this as your crib sheet. And it defines what are waters within Section 404 jurisdiction. It shows you if you're in a tidal setting, it shows you it goes up to the high tide line. It includes the mean high water is under Section 10, but also all Section 10 waters are 404. The other side shows you if you're in an inland freshwater setting, how far Section 404 extends, and also if Section 10 is applicable there. And then below is some typical examples of the kinds of activities that are regulated under these, under the various laws. So for Section 404, we, the Corps of Engineers, we regulate discharged of dredged or fill material. So if something's getting dumped into a waterway or a wetland, we regulate it. If somebody goes in with an excavator and scoops out a bunch of dirt from a wetland, that's not regulated by us. It is regulated, but not by the Corps of Engineers. And then Section 10, that's regulating structures and work within these special navigable waterways. Okay, next one. And so probably the least obvious type of water that the Corps regulates to actually delineate. And by delineation, what we mean is putting the boundary around the feature and saying, this is a wetland and everything outside of it is not a wetland. So that can get kind of tricky, as I'm sure all of you know, with a wetland. Like, where does a wetland end and an upland begin? Can be a little bit fuzzy because they're transitional habitats by ecology. So the Corps of Engineers has that word engineer in there, which means they're going to define the heck out of things, and they're going to come up with manuals, which is what we've done. And so the manual and the approach that the Corps uses looks at three categories. We look at the vegetation. Is it an upland type of vegetation that dominates, or a wet type of vegetation? We look at the soils and we look at hydrology. And somewhere where these three things overlap just perfectly, you're in a wetland. And where they are not perfectly aligned, then you're in a non-wetland or an upland. And we can go to the next slide. This, I think, just shows you some of the things we look at. So for hydrology, in some cases, especially here in California, you know, this wetland that's in the top left corner of your slide looks like there's water and plants there, but come back in late August and it'll look more like that dry, cracked, parched bit of bare soil. Um, so, but it's still a wetland, even though it's that dry for a chunk of the year. Um, so we look at the presence of water and how long water is typically there. And then we look at the soils and see if there are signatures in the soil that were formed under prolonged periods of wetness and that happen over time. So if it's wet for 3 months of the year for many years, it's going to form some of these features that we're looking for in the soils. And then finally, we're looking at the vegetation. That's the most obvious indicator. If it's a wetland, that means it supports wetland plants, basically. So and those are also the easiest to kind of map. You can see the plants. And if you're a good botanist, like most of you seem to be, you can identify which are the wetland plants and which are the upland only plants. Can we go to the next slide? And then, like I said, the engineers, we like to have manuals that tell us step by step. So we got a couple of manuals that were published. One, the Bible was published in 1986, a wetland delineation manual. And then for different parts of the US, we've developed regional supplements to that set of guidelines. We can go to the next slide. And are we going into, oh, here's a couple of examples of wetland type habitats. So this, I believe, was taken, I can't remember exactly where, but it's a wetland around the bay. I think it may, well, I'm not even going to guess. But you can see in the foreground is a channel slough. Then you see some, looks like upland areas, but then further out you see some marshy types plants. And then you see what I think is the bay and shorebirds. You can go to the next slide. And here are the very cute vernal pools. This is up, I think, in the Santa Rosa Plain. You see some very distinct, these plants are dominated by, or the plants here are dominated by the yellow ones, the Contra Costa goldfields that are, that grow in vernal pool habitat. Vernal pools hold water in the winter months, and then in the summer months, the water starts to dry up, and these wildflowers that are specialized to that habitat start to fill in, and it makes for a very lovely little landscape. Next slide. Alrighty, and with this, yeah, good.
Yes. So now we've talked about geographically where the Corps regulates, and now we're going to talk about what kind of activities the Corps regulates. So Frankie already went over it a little bit, but under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, we regulate the discharge of fill or dredged materials within waters of the U.S. And under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, we regulate work in, above, or below navigable waters of the U.S. So we've got some examples pulled up. This very first one you can see is a very, very bad bank failure into this creek below the road. A remedy for that would likely be something along the lines of a soldier pile wall, some riprap, something to stabilize that bank. And anything within that waterway, meaning below the ordinary high water mark, we would regulate. And the ordinary high water mark generally is about the 2-year flood mark, depending on the waterway. Some more examples. So this is a road repair site in Orinda. The very bottom left photo shows what was there, which is a very clearly undersized culvert that is now filled in with sediment. So they took out that culvert, they cleared it all out. They had some temporary measures in the top left to get water through, and the top right, and then the bottom right shows what they came up with, which is a bigger box culvert. Solutions like these provide better connections for any sort of wildlife that are living on either side of this road. Generally, we like things to be a little bit more clear span because then it totally avoids waters of the US, but this is a better plan than what they had before. This is a third example. So this is the Willits bypass in Willits. And the top right photo shows that there were lots and lots and lots of wetlands out there. And this was a big project before my time, luckily. to redo Highway 101 in Willits. It involved a lot of wetland fill, and there was lots of mitigation required for Caltrans. They needed to create those wetlands somewhere else. And that's one of the things that we regulate, or that we enforce, is the 2008 mitigation rules. So no net loss of wetlands. Last example, I believe, is we have this bank stabilization project. On the left, you can see their bank was failing, their deck was falling into the water. I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of this after these winter storms, and their solution was to lay back the bank, it looks like, and add in some riprap, which is just those big pieces of rock, which will give their house a little bit of a buffer so that it probably will not fall into the river next year. And then these are the acts and laws that we work under in addition to the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act. So when we issue permits, we need to make sure we're in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. And while we don't directly work under the California Environmental Quality Act, many of the agencies that we work with, including the Water Board and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, do. We implement the Endangered Species Act under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, Essential Fish Habitat. You can read it all there. These are all things that we all laws that we work under when we issue permits. Next up is, again, Frankie.
Oh, great, thanks. So let's jump to the next one, because now we're going to talk about you guys and why you might want to give some serious thought to a career in regulatory. So the types of folks who get jobs in the regulatory program at the Corps and at some of those other agencies that Elise showed on the last slide ranges from biologists to ecologists, hydrogeomorphologists, people with very long names to pronounce. Elise and I were just discussing, both of us have a geography background, and we were trying to decide whether we should just change our name from geographers to geographists to fit with all the other scientists, but decided we keep it as geographers on the slide. But in any case, big variety of types of folks who end up in this field. And so you guys, I'm sure, fit based on education background and also obviously on inclination. You guys are clearly interested in the environment and interested in ways that you can be helping the environment and also working outdoors where it's nice. So so just keep in mind that at least probably 20% of a project manager's time is field trips, field work. We're not necessarily doing the some of the more exciting work like pulling French broom and cotoneasters. But we are out there looking at project sites, helping to decide what are the better methods that a applicant could use, et cetera, et cetera. So just putting it out there every time I can to say why you would want to work at the Corps. Next slide. The other thing to think about are, so here are some of the major issues in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't issues everywhere in California and everywhere in the US. But we were focusing because, because San Francisco District is in the Bay Area, but also because I think a lot of you folks are based out of the Marin office of the Environment for the Americas, but maybe I'm wrong there. We can change the talk next time if you want me to include other Americas. But for now, water quality, loss and degradation of habitat, climate change, sea level rise with that. And then some of these other things like development and housing supply, those are major issues in the Bay Area, and they sort of clash with the issue about loss and degradation of habitat. endangered species, habitat, and recovery. And then I know that you guys are also interested in this tribal and cultural resource protection and use. So let's get to a few examples and next slide. We're going to look at fish habitat. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So here's a slide that kind of gives you an image of what nice fish habitat looks like. You have low-hanging vegetation over a channel that provides not only shade to keep the channel water cool, but also places to hide from predators. And also to be able to feed and go move between riffles safely, moderate temperature, etc. So this is nice, an example of nice fish habitat. The next slide shows kind of a disturbing trend, and we didn't update this slide, sorry, but it hasn't changed much. This trend in the population of salmonids, in this example, the wild coho in California. The population across the board of salmonids is in basically a very bad downward spiral for a host of reasons. But among those are loss of that kind of nice habitat that we just showed you. There's a lot of dams that have been constructed across fish spawning rivers, but also just loss of the habitat itself. We can go to the next slide. And in this slide, we're looking at an example, and this was a short paper written about a restoration project, Weller Creek Stream Bank Stabilization. And even though that top photo looks kind of messy and you see a lot of, woody debris and mixes of rocks and such in the channel, that's actually a functioning stream ecosystem. There's a lot of diversity in there. When the water's higher, there's places to sort of be protected from high flows, etc. The lower photo is the kind of thing that salmonids don't like, which is all the vegetation is gone. You've got these hardened channel banks. The channel itself can't move. I think all of you know that rivers don't just, the water is not the only thing moving, the river itself is moving. It meanders across the landscape. So in this setting, in the picture below, there's not going to be much movement of that channel until a really big rain year like we've had, and then it overflows the banks and houses get flooded and we have problems. So this kind of hardening is not a good environmental alternative. You can go to the next one. Yeah, so here is just an example of some of the urban creeks that we see in places like Marin, East Bay, all around, right? Businesses often build right up to the edge of a creek. Sometimes the creek was put into a hardened channel so that businesses could. And it's obviously not good for the creek, and it often isn't good for the business because water is a powerful force and continues to erode. So there's a push by agencies like the Corps, but also the Water Board and other agencies that have resources they're protecting in these streams to really try to get thoughtful stabilization techniques used in some of these urban creeks, like replacing concrete and big chunks of rock with more biological stabilization, like laying back the banks, planting them with vegetation, allowing for a certain amount of overflow of the water so that you don't have to just keep it in a deep U-shaped channel. We can go to the next slide. Here's an example. It's kind of a before and after example. So and it's a neat project in the Berkeley Hills, where back in the 30s, several of the local streams that used to flow to the bay were placed in concrete and stone channels. And this is up near the Rose Garden in Berkeley. This is Cordonices Creek. And a couple of landowners whose houses are right on these properties decided, let's take this creek out of that channel and make a more natural stream bank setting here. So that's what they did. And they, yes, they had to give up part of their, where that man is standing. They had to sort of sacrifice that from being a patio to being part of the riverbank system. Um, and so the photo on the top right is sort of in process. They've done the constructing. They've started taking the stream out of its channel bank and putting in some stabilization of rock, but also laying back the sides, planting them. And then in the photo below, it shows sort of that development of as the plants come in, it's starting to look more natural, providing habitat for other animals that might use the waterways, including, fish, aquatic insects, birds, and other. Well, I'm sure they get plenty of deer coming down in there too. Next slide. And so this is, I mean, we actually could probably update this slide even with one from, where was that levee? I forget, but there was some levee in the Central Valley where the levee was failing and the guy parked his Dodge Ram or whatever truck it was into the breach to stabilize the levee. But anyway, this is an example of not very good bank stabilization. It's basically concrete rubble and bits of old car pieces. I mean, just basically finding a bunch of junk to pile up along the bank and try to protect against the water eroding it. So this is something we would not permit. The above project where they were laying back the sides and putting in some rock, but also making it habitat. That's the sort of thing we work with them. We say, great idea, let's see what other things you can do to improve this habitat. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. And so I want to talk specifically for just a little bit about planning for climate change and sort of the challenges that face the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically the bay itself. And I know you guys do a lot of work along the coastline, but there's a reason for why I'm focusing on this. But starting with the San Francisco Bay Estuary has had a historic loss in tidal marsh habitat. And tidal marshes ring the estuary and have provided basically nature's flood protection for thousands and thousands of years. And they've also been developing for pretty much the last 10,000 years. And then along came people. And since the late 1800s, we've lost almost 90% of all that historic tideland that used to ring the San Francisco Bay Estuary. And a lot of it was lost to agriculture. They call it reclaiming, land reclamation. That means that they take away the wetland habitat, fill it with a bunch of dirt, and turn it into agricultural land, or developing cities around the bay, which, you take a picture of now what's around the bay and what you see are buildings and pavement and such. So this is not a very good place to be starting from for addressing climate change, and in particular for us, the effects of sea level rise that are predicted in the next 50 to 100 years. So let's go to the next slide. And this just talks about the graphic that will appear on the right. Is everybody's delayed a little bit on that, or is it just me? It's probably just me. Anyway, so the graphic on the right shows what used to be the situation back in around 1800, where mostly the green is mostly tidal marsh, and the light brown is tidal flats. And the takeaway from this graphic is mainly that if you look at around 1800, what surrounded the bay was tidal wetlands and mud flats. By 1998, what dominates is development and salt ponds, some diked wetlands, but very little of that green left. And what we're trying to do, looking towards the future, is to restore as many more of those wetlands as we can. And there are several planning documents that have been that are in the works, calling for restoration of tidal marshlands, and because of the role they play for habitat, but also natural flood protection. Marshes are great for absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's a lot of benefits to having tidal marshes and other types of wetlands. So let's go quickly to the next slide. This is the Bayland Goals update, focused on not just restoring a place, but a whole process. So in other words, don't just go and do spot restoration of small wetlands, of creeks here and there, but think about the whole watershed, and all the processes excuse me, that are needed to make your environment full of healthy, functioning habitats. One of the processes that is getting more attention is sedimentation. We don't have enough sediment to sustain tidal marshes around the bay, that would be needed to keep pace with rising sea level. So wetlands can keep pace with sea level rise if sea level rise is slow. It's been slowly rising for the last 10,000 years. But when it accelerates, then you need more sediments for the marshes to keep pace. And that's something we don't have as much of. For all the things we've done to the waterways in California, we have resulted in losing sediment that would otherwise come here. So that's a process we're looking at. Let's go to the next one. And so here's where I was saying I'm gonna explain why I'm interested in telling you about the San Francisco Bay marshes. It's because I have been fortunate enough at the Corps to be able to work in what we call an interagency group, which is a group of project managers from all these different resource agencies, like the Water Board, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, like NOAA NIMFS, which is the National Marine Fisheries Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Bay Conservation Development Corps, BCDC. We're working with all of these agencies, have laws that protect resources. So when there are restoration groups out there that want to restore tidal wetland habitat, well, they're doing activities that are regulated. Even though they're good activities and positive benefit, they still are regulated. And the permitting process with that many agencies gets complicated. So we put together a team of regulators who we work exclusively on these projects with the project proponents. We help them through the complexities of our laws. And whenever there's any kind of difference of opinion between agencies about certain aspects of a project, the agency members talk it out with each other. We come up with a compromise. We work with the applicants. So basically, we're trying to meet the urgency of getting these restoration projects going quickly enough so that we, as sea levels start to really accelerate in how quickly they're rising, we can have good restoration habitats already out there and in place. So let's jump to the most important part of the talk. I'm going to hand it back over to Elise about jobs.
Yes, the most exciting part. So very exciting for the Corps is that we do have a position open, several positions, I'm sure, open right now. If you go to USA Jobs, this little link here will take you to this web page, which gives you more information. This is the job that Frankie and I have, what we work under, you can see the pay scale on the side. All government employee salaries are publicly available. So if you search, you can see the pay scale. It's GS7 through 11. You can search that pay scale and find out how much you would make and what the cost of living increases for where you live. In the Bay Area, ours is a huge increase from the national base. So that is great. And if you have any questions, you can direct them to Katerina. She's asked us to give you her information. So there's her email there. She is Frankie and I's supervisor, and she's the supervisor for the South Branch, so kind of San Francisco and South. And she can answer pretty much any question you have if you are looking to apply. Other jobs available in the federal government. So USA Jobs is a great place to look for any sort of federal government jobs. It's where they all get posted. We have the Pathways Fellowship, which is for recent grads, and it's an internship, and you get to experience not just regulatory, but other parts of the Corps as well, including planning and real estate and probably Office of Counsel as well. We have someone going through that right now, and she's really enjoying it. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a similar program, as well as NOAA NIMS and the EPA, all agencies that we work really closely with. And then state jobs we have here. So again, these are the agencies we talked about a little bit. The Regional Water Quality Control Board, which also works under the Clean Water Act, but they regulate water pollution. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they implement lots of laws, but including the California Endangered Species Act. The Coastal Commission works under the Coastal Zone Management Act, and they provide permits for development along the coastline. The SFBay, we call it BCDC, the Conservation and Development Commission, is similar to the Coastal Commission, but specific to the San Francisco Bay. And then the California Department of Transportation is just another agency that doesn't so much permit, but gets permits from us, but it's a similar field. And that is the end of our presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we can go ahead, and if anybody has any questions or, I don't know, comments, fun stories, recipes that you want to share, go ahead.
Recipes. One thing that Katerina was telling us earlier today was for the job announcement that just went out, it's continuous, so it's open until December 2023. So it's open for a while, and also it's part of a direct hire, whatever that is. Specifically, what that means is you don't have to go through quite the number of bureaucratic hoops that federal jobs often involve. So it means you'll hear back pretty quickly and get, selected for an interview process, and your application goes directly to the San Francisco district. It doesn't have to go through like a federal filter in Washington or something. So the good news is it all goes a lot faster. Oh, thanks. Elise put her contact. I'll put mine in there too.